January 3rd is the day that, in many respects, we learn assassination could be public, escalation of this magnitude can be survived politically, international law can be ignored without consequence, and chaos can be managed afterward. I just want to slow this down for a second because, like, right now, people are smashing together a couple of different things, and that's exactly how you lose the plot and like the fog of war. There is the event, and there are images of the event, and if you don't separate those two things, you're gonna get played. Okay, like the event is this. Like we know because of the explosions, right? Multiple major outlets are reporting, and we've seen the videos, we've seen new like thousands and thousands of witnesses and people who've been possibly killed by these pre-dawn U.S. strikes in and around Caracas, Venezuela. Massive explosions and also power outages all over the city. And then on top of that, a sitting U.S. president, Donald Trump, publicly states that Venezuela's elected president and his wife had been captured and flown out of the country. Like that alone is insane. And then there's these images, and I haven't seen any of the news circulating any of these images, but there's photos circulating online supposedly showing Maduro being detained. That image is pretty high risk evidence at this moment. It's unverified, possibly AI generated. There is no proof of life release, no neutral confirmation, and that image should not be foundational to anything. And here's the key point. I'm talking about the image that I'm using on the thumbnail, but it's just the key point is like people keep missing this about like the conditions that we're in right now. You don't need the image to be fake to form like the point that I'm getting at here to still apply. Like even if half of these claims are real, this is one of the biggest escalations in like Western hemispheric politics in decades, like since 9/11, because a foreign power claiming that it seized a sitting head of state, it's not sanctions, right? It's not pressure. It's not strongly worded concern. It's forcible removal. It is regime decapitation, and it's done openly. And that's not political policy. That's a fascist that's a fascist maneuver on behalf of a fascist government that is committing like neo-imperialism in the Western Hemisphere. And that's why, like, should those images of Maduro be real and this all is irreal, like international law and whatever that is over. And to say that is not hyperbole either. Like it doesn't mean that we're going to live in a lawless society, but on paper it's just anything goes at this point. Like we live in the jungle now. It means like just like the rule of the jungle is quietly replacing the rule of law, and it applies to anybody who is doesn't have the ability, like deterrence and the ability to make it so that these things don't happen to them, right? Like this is the jungle. Like not because there are no rules, but because only some people are allowed to break them. Now, this is where it gets even darker because this kind of action collapses the distinction between war and quote unquote law enforcement. And that's been the direction of US foreign policy for years now. Everything gets reframed as counter drug, counter terror, criminal indictment, trafficking, organized crime. And the reason for that is because if you call it war, people start asking questions. And if you call it law enforcement, people just shrug. And if you package military force as arresting a criminal, you short circuit public opinion's anti-war reflex. You don't need declarations, you don't need, congressional debates. You don't need consent. You just say we're enforcing the law. And that's how these types of extraordinary, cowardly acts of violence become standard operating procedure. And that's how, like, missiles and whatever Apache helicopter shit that they used here turns into just political policy. And once we cross that line, you don't just threaten the sovereignty of Venezuela, you open up an endless can of worms that will just deteriorate into the type of violence that we've seen engulf us all. And this is not too different than that. And this is a threat to the safety of the world and to everybody outside of the core bloc, because the precedent that's set here isn't we need to remove bad leaders. It's the precedent is that remove leaders that are inconvenient. It's not even that they're bad, it's just that they're inconvenient. Like, this could have been resolved, but instead we have an escalation that it's just absurd. It should truly terrify anybody, regardless of what side of the political spectrum you are on, because today it's Venezuela, tomorrow it's someone else with the wrong allegiances and incentives, the wrong resources, the wrong level of burgeoning independence. And Latin America knows this pattern. It's not abstract there, it's muscle memory. And that's the part here where people still don't want to grapple with. It's like, this isn't just a tactical act, it's straight up psychological warfare. Like, the message here isn't only aimed at Venezuela, it's aimed at all regional governments, that your sovereignty is conditional. It's aimed at militaries. Your command chain can be bypassed very easily. And it's aimed, most importantly, at the people who are consuming it, like me and you, right? Like, your participation in this thing is purely just as consumption and nothing else. And that's what these types of rituals are. And, like, that's why it feels like a civilizational escalation. Not because of the body count, because of the claim of authority. And notice how fast the media machine snapped into place. Suddenly, every former official and every think tank ghoul, every reasonable expert is on TV telling you to slow down, wait for details, avoid jumping to conclusions, not because they care about the truth, but because they care about narrative stabilization. And you'll hear things like, we don't know all the facts yet. This is very complex. Both sides needed to de-escalate. And buried in that sleight of hand, America is never the active subject of the sentence, right? Things happen, tensions rise, regions spiral into violence, and the U.S. always just reacts to the conditions they're given. And when you see it that way, when you report it that way, it's not journalism. Like, even when you consume it and tell your friends, you're just laundering an imperial lie, imperial mythos. And which is why, again, like, the correct move here is not to scream, like, it's not to like hold out, it's not to separate Maduro as if Maduro doesn't have some type of representation of, like, the will of the people in Venezuela, because he does, and we're going to see that. And the correct move is to verify everything and to not play into psychological warfare and information warfare, fog of war, because major media outlets are going to report what they're reporting. The US strikes, and Trump claiming that Maduro has been captured, and these viral images that are going around are not proof, because I still hold out a 0.5% belief that those images are fake, and that there still needs to be more genuine proof that he actually had been captured, or like that he's alive, right? But the political meaning of this action and these claims, even without any type of visual confirmation, one way or the other, is just enormous. It's unprecedented, like, in our time, because claims like this are not just, and actions like this are not just made casually. You don't just accidentally do this. You don't just, commit extraterrestrial seizure of a head of state. You don't float that into the world unless you're trying to push reality into a certain direction, testing reactions, testing norms, testing how far the window can be shoved. And this is the real point. Like, we live in the jungle. Like, it's not about saying that rules don't exist. It's about saying like rules exist in a new, more sophisticated, layered apparatus that, depending on the conditions you live in the material core, may be on the outside of. And when it seeks compliance, the law will be invoked. When it wants results, it will be bypassed. And that bypass will be continuously uncomfortable. And media and other political institutions, politicians throughout the entire Western liberal order are going to help normalize this, just as they did when they invaded Iraq and Libya, etc. Because that's the system, and that's why in the end, like, if those images are real or not, it doesn't really matter. Like, images like that obviously are being used for information warfare, and until we see Maduro like brought somewhere, which I don't know. Maybe they are going to do that, and if they do, that will be that will be fucked. And that's the thing, is those types of images, those types of spectacles, they will pull people into these types of political debates. Well, the structure is long moved past those debates, and the real danger at this point isn't whether or not those photos are real. The danger is that a world power has just committed extrajudicial arrest over a sovereign head of state's leader. And if that becomes normal, then yes, international law, as people imagine, it is finished. Not with a bang, but with a very Lynch-esque dystopian shrug. So let's not get lost in it. If that image is real, even if it's not, and he ends up being in custody, it's still just a thumbnail at the end of the day. But I've seen numerous people showing many different images of Maduro being detained, some with blood on his shirt, some not with blood on his shirt. But it's not, in the end, that's just a distraction. And don't get caught up in like the wait and see politics of this, and don't let this be reframed as just another confusing foreign crisis, because if this act stands even partially, it's not just unprecedented, it's a global threat, because it is a line that cannot be crossed and maintain a coherent and sustainable social structure. And that line was just crossed. And lines like that only matter until people prove that they don't. And they prove that they don't over and over and over again until those lines are no longer even there, because of their demonstrations that there is no more line. And we're going to cross it, and there's nothing you can do about it. And that's what these types of blatant, egregious acts of imperial violence, regardless of the consequences, are done, because they want to say, we'll do it, and there's nothing you can do to stop us. And the worst part of this is that if this works, it will continue. It will be another, like, again, like this being on the 6-year anniversary of the assassination of Soleimani. It's not a coincidence, because these things are prototypes. They're reused, and it's not because it's the moral, not because of the moralism, not because of the legalism, but because it doesn't trigger any consequences. And that's how the empire knows it's still in charge. That's how the jungle forms, is because of that. The inner, the like it comes from when the highest, when the alpha dog, when the alpha lion is scared. It has no self-confidence. And in those moments is when that's when that's when the jungle forms. It doesn't form from chaos. It forms from the successful formation of new precedences without resistance. And yeah, and like I said, it's 6 years to the day. Like, That's not some spooky coincidence, right? It's not astrology for geopolitics. It's a very real rupture point. Like it's the same reason why 9/11 happened on the same day as the Chilean coup in 1973. You know what I mean? Like there's reasons that these dates become symbolic. And January 3rd, this date, right? It isn't symbolic because it feels heavy. It's symbolic because everything that follows is downstream from this. And this is I can it's a demonstrated fact. Like when the US assassinated Qasem Soleimani on January 3rd, 2020, it wasn't just a killing, it was the moment that the post Cold War rules finally collapsed in front of the public. Not quietly, not ambiguously, in the middle of the night, just after New Year's, in a flash of news media spectacle. And up until that moment, up until that night, there was still a thin fiction holding this system together for many people that were born post World War II. And it was very much just a shared lie that senior state officials were off limits. That type of escalation had built in guardrails, and the assassinations of those kinds were things that were often denied, not openly announced, right? And that like international law mattered at least enough to pretend. And that all that fiction died on a Baghdad tarmac. And the reason that everything feels more unstable since then is because it is. Like the system didn't adapt smoothly. Look how much the world has changed since then. The system absolutely cracked. And then people pretend they just have this amnesia like it didn't. Look at what has happened inside Iran and immediately since after those events. Like Soleimani wasn't just a military figure, he was a stabilizer inside a fragile political ecosystem. He absorbed pressure, he mediated between factions, he embodied external defense in a way that gave the state internal legitimacy. And when he was killed, Iran didn't just lose a general, it lost its pressure valve. And suddenly, the Iranian state had to prove strength outward while holding itself together inward. And that's a brutal position to be in because you either risk escalating war or you absorb the hit and look weak. And either option, and we've been through this numerous times, like either option tears at legitimacy because both options just radicalize and escalate the situation. And Iran chose restraint externally and consolidation internally. And that decision locked the country into a permanent emergency mode. And that's what people don't want to connect to the unrest that you see carrying out, even to this day, unrest that's going on today, like in Iran, like those protests, the repression, the cycles of social distrust, the sense that the state is always braced for the next strike against the vulnerable, that didn't appear out of nowhere. It's the psychological aftermath of many things, but most recently, the rift in the fragile fabric of the way that things are held together in part of the general's doing, like his political, just as a political figurehead and just as a capable person willing to take those risks and chances as a politician slash war general and understanding and being able to embody those contradictions. And then 3 days later, 3 days after he died, in response, in a panic during various attacks. They were under attack from the US and there was a fire exchange and Iran accidentally shot down Ukraine International Airlines flight 752. And that wasn't just a random tragedy, right? Like that was the physical consequence of that escalation. because Iran's air defenses were on hair trigger alert because they fully expected retaliation. Command and control was obviously stretched because of the situation, and communications clearly degraded, and one mistake, one misread radar blip, whether by a human being or not, 176 civilians were dead. And with that, Flight 752 wasn't just a terrible error, it was the sound of the system breaking. And notice what happened next. That crash became a narrative accelerant because overnight, Iran went from victim of an illegal assassination to global pariah all over again. Western media stopped talking about the Soleimani strike almost entirely, and the conversation flipped to Iran's actions, and Iran's credibility was completely shredded. And that sanction logic, that Western sanction logic, hardened, and sympathy for them evaporated overnight. And that's how these types of escalations work now. Commit a violation so severe that it destabilizes the system, and then you let that instability produce secondary disasters that you can point to, later as justification for your unprecedented acts. And January 3rd, 2020, didn't just kill General Soleimani. It removed the needed friction that keeps the system together, and it made things all fall apart much faster than they were. And this is where Ukraine enters the picture, because Iran's isolation after 2020 didn't just get deeper, it was directional. Because once diplomacy with the West collapsed entirely, Iran had no incentive for balance. And so survival meant alignment, and not because Iran suddenly was in love with Russia or China, but because blocks harden. And when you burn bridges, they burn hard. And by the time that the war in Ukraine escalated 2 years later, at around the exact same time, like about what, 25 months after that, the geopolitical chessboard had already been perfectly set for what was next. And it wouldn't have been able to be set if it wasn't for the actions that Trump took 2 years prior. And with that, like, Iran didn't drift into Russia's orbit accidentally. It was pushed there by the consequences of what happened with with Soleimani. And this is what people miss when they talk about Ukraine, as if it came out of nowhere. Like, even apart from the Donbass and all of that, but just internationally. Because there was things that created the conditions for that to be even somewhat acceptable. And those chain reactions go like that because you normalize assassination. Those assassinations trigger permanent escalation anxiety. That anxiety produces catastrophic mistakes. Those mistakes harden social narratives that just creates divide. And then those narratives create social blocks and political blocks, and those political blocks and that strife makes the inevitable civil dissolution of any type of trust in the state inevitable. And that flight 752 is the hinge, because it's the moment where a single assassination cascades into a national tragedy that completely reshapes alliances and accelerated global polarization. And it didn't cause the Ukraine war by itself, but it removed many shock absorbers that were previously there. And that's what's going to happen here. And because, like, once those shock absorbers are gone, systems don't snap back. They shatter, and they shatter forward. And that's why, again, 6 years to the day, January 3rd, January, it keeps coming back. And it's not because, like, history is poetic, but because these things happen in cycles, and you have to create conditions for things to be accepted, and those conditions move in cycles, and sometimes there's parallels that emerge. And here, January 3rd is the day that, in many respects, we learn assassination could be public, escalation of this magnitude can be survived politically, international law can be ignored without consequence, and chaos can be managed afterward. And every time it happens, whether it was in 1961, in 2020, now in 2026, like it's every time that this happens, whether it's, like I said, it's the same reason why 9/11 is the same day as the Chilean coup, right? Like these dates matter, and it's testing acceptance in a way. It's building structure. It's building structures to test acceptance of things that are unprecedented, and seeing how much more the world is willing to absorb. And that's why, again, strife in Iran that's happening today is tied to that moment 6 years ago. And that's why the tragedy of Flight 752 matters beyond just a national tragedy. And that's why the invasion of Ukraine can't be it can't be understood without like tracing that fracture that goes back to early 2020 and obviously everything else that came with it. And people want clean timelines, discrete crises, neat causes, but that's not how it works, right? Like these things happen in cycles and snowballs and like in building contradictions with tipping points. And we're living in like a ripple of a previous aftershock of a contradictions that have not been resolved. And these dates, January 3rd, is when the old restraint dies. When, like I said, Flight 752 is the consequence that becomes undeniable. And then the invasion of Ukraine is where the new order turns hot because what they're willing to do. And everything else that's come after that, right? And what's happening here is another escalation of a can of worms, a demon genie that you can't get back in the bottle. And if 6 years later, the same date right here is being used again in any way, it's not accidental. It's a reminder, not to us, but to everyone with the eyes to see it, right? And this is what happens when you accept that assassination is a political policy. This is what happens when escalation that can bring about global world war stops being taboo and starts being more about potential outcomes. And this is what happens when international law becomes less about optics and more about who's going to stop us, right? And that's the most dangerous part. And it's not that the system is broken, it's that it's going to just keep going anyway, even if it is broken, right? There's nothing going to, there's no resistance against this decaying order. So it's only going to go to new toxic and like corrosive layers that it's never been to. And we're experiencing that today, you know? And this is just how global conflict starts, right? It's things like this. You can't, you can't put some of these demon genies back in their bottle after they've been birthed. And we're living in the wake of that.